Hi everybody, this is Hero back with another Dragonflight video, and I'd like to talk about Unholy DK in this video. We are currently in the alpha, so a lot can change, but I've come up with a build idea that I think is kind of interesting, given that we have a lot more choice and interactions in these talent trees than we currently do on live. And this idea is, now don't shoot me, it is a minionless Unholy DK build. Not entirely true. We still keep Little Timmy, but other than Little Timmy, we are not doing anything related to minions. And the reason why I think this build might be kind of good in single target is because of some of the awesome changes we are getting to the talent trees, the synergies that we can now put together both on the class side and on the spec side. So let's get into it. I want to begin by just highlighting what I meant by some of the synergies that are now available. If you look in the first row, the 15 tier and the 35 tier, we now have access to multiple of these pieces. Infected Claws is essentially a resource talent because our Timmy is going to give us wounds that we can then bust. This essentially says over a certain amount of time you have to press your Festering Strike less often. So you have to generate wounds less often, which means you can use your runes to spend and break the wounds with Scourge Strike. Awesome. That was competing with Clawing Shadows, which is a Scourge Strike modifier that basically says Scourge Strike now scales 100% with your mastery, which is excellent. If we're getting, now we're getting both more wounds to break, and we are also able to access better mastery scaling on that breakage or the spender. Good stuff. For 35 tier, even more valuable. Both the Pestilent Pustules and the Harbinger of Doom are now accessible, and we also get Soul Reaper in the class side. So we have all three of those if we want them. Pestilent Pustules giving us Runic Corruption, which increases the regeneration rate of our runes. That's resource oriented. Awesome stuff. Harbinger of Doom giving us up to 2 stacks of Sudden Doom. Sudden Doom is based on our auto attack. So when we auto attack, we have a chance to get a free Death Coil. That's just free resources, which again feeds into the spending of runic power, which is going to again generate more resources for us. So we can stack that up to 2 times. Gives us a little leeway that we won't miss a proc. And again, guys, auto attack stuff is going to be insane going into next tier because of the changes to the class side. So those 2 rows specifically being brought in line with one another so we can have access to both pieces, and in the case of the 35 tier, all 3, mean that we suddenly have the makings of another kind of build for Unholy DK. So let's head back and walk through it. Why do I think auto attacks are going to be significant? Well, it's partly because we can get access to a lot of the tools in Frost DK's kit that they have access to right now, and we can suddenly take up as Unholy DKs. Runic Empowerment versus Runic Corruption typically has been a division of specs, with the Runic Corruption going toward the Unholy DK and the Runic Empowerment going towards Frost. We can now, due to, as I just said, Pestilent Pustules, get access to both. So whenever we burst a wound, we might get Runic Corruption, which is going to increase the rune regeneration. But now we can also potentially get free runes back, which is essentially more Scourge Strikes or Clawing Shadows usages just by doing Runic Power Spending. So casting a Death Coil is going to potentially give us a rune back for free, right? 2% chance for every single cast of Death Coil, and whatever the cast of the Runic Power of Death Coil ends up being in the end. So maybe this is 10%. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be 5 or 10. It doesn't matter. The point is we now have access to both sides of the rune regeneration columns, either getting really fast runes or getting free ones back. All of this is excellent to have synergizing together. But we're not done. Auto attacks are now amazing for Unholy DKs. We have Runic Attenuation, meaning our auto attacks have a chance to give us resources. Awesome. Icy Talons, giving us attack speed. 6, 12, 18% attack speed for a 6-second window by spending Runic Power. And we spend our Runic Power, of course, on Death Coils. So Essentially, the more often we auto attack, the more often we're going to proc Sudden Doom. The more often we proc Sudden Doom, the more often we get free death coils. And with Harbinger of Doom, those free death coils are going to give us more Icy Talon stack. You see the synergy, guys? Very, very strong synergy here. Auto attacking gives us more free death coils. The death coils are going to feed into Icy Talons. Icy Talons is also going to give us not just attack speed, but more runic power, which means more death coils, and not just more runic power, but more Sudden Doom procs. So that's a nice tightly knit combo. And what we can do in between is we can fit in a whole bunch of other resource related pieces from the class tree. Things like Horn of Winter, which is again a frost ability that's now coming into the tree. That's just a 45-second window to keep the cycle going. More runic power, more runes to reset things. Awesome. Empowered rune weapon, more haste, and generating what? Both kinds of resources, runes and runic power, smoothing out the rotation on the 2-minute cycle. And then we have some spots like here, Rune Mastery, and I believe there's another one here, Infestermite. That means whenever we are popping wounds or whether we are consuming a rune, we are getting access to strength scaling potentially. So both of these are essentially the same thing because Scourge Strength, which is a rune spender, is the main way that we pop any of our festering wounds. So whenever we do it, we have a chance to get both Rune Mastery, which is strength, and also to stack up Festermite. All of this is looking really good so far, meaning it is a tight-knit set of relationships. So aside from scaling, whatever you say about tuning, these are all theoretically working together nicely. Now, on the spec side, here's how we start to think about scaling it. Harbinger of Doom, as I mentioned before, it's just nice synergy with all these auto attacks. The Clawing Shadows or Infected Claws, which is usually what we're competing with on some of these other pieces. Now we're getting more Festering Wounds, so we can spend more time pressing Scourge Strike. Clawing Shadows. Clawing Shadows giving us pure shadow scaling. Awesome. Death and Decay, again, in Pestilence. If we have our D&D down, Unholy Ground as well as another reason to do that in single target, we get more wounds. Now, again, this is probably the weaker point of the build because you don't necessarily need to be pressing D&D. It might just be a waste. But nevertheless, it's here if we wanted it. Pestilent Pustules. Runic Corruption. Death Rod. Hold on a second. This is where it starts to get crazy. Death Coil debilitates your enemy, applying a debuff, which increases their shadow damage taken up to 20%. If Death Coil consumes Sudden Doom, it applies 2 stacks of Death Rod. Whoa. So this means that we can scale shadow damage taken, not just mastery, because remember, mastery is both increased shadow damage and increased minion damage. But Death Rot says, I only care about scaling the shadow damage side of that equation. So it will not affect the minion stuff that does not do shadow damage. Does that make sense? So General Timmy auto attacks. Monstrosity gets, I think, some shadow damage scaling on its auto attacks. But other things like Army of the Dead auto attacks are all physical. Apocalypse, there's a mix, right? But I don't think it's all shadow damage in Army of the Damned. Gargoyle, I believe, it might be shadow damage. I can't recall. But I think it might also just be physical. But Death Rock, guys, is a giant boost to the value of Sudden Doom. Because now our auto attacks, giving us free Sudden Doom procs, are also going to feed into the shadow damage loop. And remember, the main mechanic of Unholy DK is build up wounds and break them. There's a couple of ways to build them. You either build it through Festering Strike, you build it through the claws of our dudes, you build it through Death and Decay, which is probably the weakest way to build, and then you break it with Scourge Strike. And we want to do this as often as we possibly can. That means that we get lots of opportunity to Sudden Doom. It's going to be awesome. Unholy Assault is the other piece. Well, I forgot about this one, of course, the strength stacking, but that's great. Unholy Assault is the other way for us to build stacks without spending Festering Strike. So we just, on a 1.5 minute cooldown, you guys have seen this before, we put 4 Festering Wounds on, we get an insane haste proc, which again, we can put together with something like Empowered Rune Weapon. Pretty solid. That gives us insane haste, which means we get insane auto attacks, which means we get more sudden doom procs, which means we get more death rot, which means what? We get more runic corruption, or we get more runic empowerment, because both of them are tied together. Just in case you didn't see what runic corruption says, whenever you spend runic power, you have a chance to increase rune regeneration. So it's both sides. All of this feeds so nicely together, guys. Really, really nice. Again, scaling aside. So then, how do we modify it on the other side of the tree? If we're avoiding minions because they do physical kinds of damage, they don't scale shadow damage, and they don't have interactions the way we want, we can pick up some more value on our Festering Strike cast. So this ability, however they want to change it and scale it, and they're probably going to change it, this is likely to say something like pressing Festering Strike is more efficient on your resources. Some kind of version of that. Either you get more wounds, so pressing this one time gives you 6 wounds, so you only have to press it once and then you can spam Scourge Strike. Or maybe it's you press it once and there's a chance to gain more damage on your runes. I don't know, but the point is, on your wound procs, they're likely to have some button here, whether it's a 3-pointer or something else, that says Festering Strike is more efficient. Now, we don't mind the Festering Strike damage, but really we care about the wound damage over here. But we come down this side, we grab basic abilities to cause diseases. I don't think Epidemic's that great for our purposes on single target, but it's here. We get Death Coil cost reduction, which is immensely valuable because now we are getting free sudden dooms from all the auto attacks. And then whenever we have to cast a runic power spending Death Coil, we can cast more of them to build up Death Rot, more shadow damage. Awesome. And those are, of course, going to produce more instances of runic corruption and runic empowerment. So that's good. Infected Claws we have to have as just a passive way to generate resources. All will serve. I don't think this is going to be valuable because the skeleton minion's not going to have the same effect as your ghoul. But nevertheless. Then we get an execute alongside Soul Reaper, right? We get just free execute on what? All of our major abilities. Death Coil, shadow damage. Soul Reaper is shadow damage. It's Shadow Frost, but it's shadow damage. Festering Strike is physical damage, so it's kind of garbage. But our Scourge Strikes are now shadow damage. So perfect. Execute. Unholy Blight, this is another great 45-second ability. And in case you missed what it does, it's giving you 2 diseases. It's giving you your main disease, Virulent Plague, and then it's stacking up over the 6 seconds that it's operating, another disease that deals X amount of damage. But this is great because it scales with morbidity. And this is what helps make the tree really clean all the way through. Everything else on here, guys, is essentially minion related or a pathway to minion damage. So we have Dark Transformation, we have which leads us to Army of the Dead. And then we have to take one of these 2 files, either Unholy Pact, which is related to minions, and down here again, Dark Transformation changes related to minions to get us to Apocalypse. Here we can do some AoE cleave stuff, which is fine. It might be nice to get improved Death Coil. If they added some little connection here, it would be insane. But nevertheless, this is all minion stuff, minion stuff, minion stuff, and on the right side, minion stuff down to Gargoyle. We can avoid almost all of it and get a completely clean build. And then what Unholy Blight says is for X amount of time, essentially 20 seconds, we now have 2 diseases on the target that we can scale with morbidity. So 6% flat when we have just Virulent Plague, and then in the 20-second window that Unholy Blight is applying this other disease, we get another 6% increase to damage for that little window. Pretty sweet. You can open with Unholy Blight into Unholy Assault, with Empowered Rune Weapon and just start going crazy with Scourge Strikes, only having the Festering Strike like once in a while, and it'll just be Scourge Strike, Doom, Scourge Strike into Death Coil, Scourge Strike, Death Coil, Scourge Strike, Death Coil, over and over and over again. One Festering Strike, and again, the Scourge Strikes are going to proc Death Coil, and Death Coil is going to give us the Frost Runic Empowerment, which gives us another rune back. Really cool stuff. I love that they've designed it this way. You don't need to do it this way. There are lots of cool ideas that just go full ham on the minions, but this is the one that I think is most impressive to me in its completeness. The synergy is all clearly down the tree. It's a very different way to think about how to play because you're back to the very simplified build of bursting as many sores in wounds over and over again. But it has a ton of synergy with auto attacks in the build, and I expect it to be the premier build going forward, unless the scaling is really weird. I expect it to be the premier build because you getting more auto attacks does not impact the way Army of the Dead functions, nor does it impact the way All Will Serve functions and the other minion pieces. And if you think about it, guys, if you do the minion build, you have to take up quite a few pieces that you're not entirely interested in. Here we have Outbreak and Epidemic that are kind of bad, not great for the build. The rest of this stuff synergizes nicely with what we're trying to do, which is burst as many wounds as possible, get as much runic empowerment and corruption as possible, and throw out as much death rot, 20% stack extra mastery damage as possible. So I expect that things like death rot are going to completely change how we think of Unholy DK on top of the amazing frost resources we get on this side of the tree. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Sorry it was a bit of a long one, but I think Unholy has some cool options. Let's see what they do with it in the next iteration on the Alpha Talents. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. We'll see you next time.